Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is James Offsank, as I mentioned, he, him, and I have the honor of being the president of Portland Forward. Portland Forward is an intergenerational group of change makers. We're focused on creating a difference for the region. We like to pick out the big ideas for the future of the region. Preferably, if there are not folks who are already leaning into an area, we might select that as a niche that we should focus on. Some of the work that we have done has been around campaign contribution limits, and we're really involved in helping pass those at Multnomah County and the City of Portland. We have also done some work on municipal banking, some work on transportation, and are interested in any of the places where there is a big need in our city and where we think that the city should be rising and the entire region should be rising to really make bold progress on the big issues of our time. We think that Portland can and should be a national and international leader, and we think that that requires some bravery around making bold policy actions. So tonight, I think that we're going to hear some of that, and that's part of why we're really excited to have curated such an amazing group of panelists, and we hope that that is some of why you are here as well with us. So the format for tonight, before I pass it over to our moderator for the evening, is we are going to have each of the panelists, and we have 4 panelists with us tonight, are going to give some short opening remarks about the moment that we find ourselves in the region and how that relates to the changing face of the urban core. And then we are going to have some question and answers that our moderator will conduct with the panelists. During that time, we would love for you to be submitting questions for the panelists as well. And you can put those into the chat, and we will be curating questions as they come in and sending them to Rebecca, who will then be either calling on specific members of the panel or else posing something to the entire panel, just depending on the nature of the question. And then we will go until about 7:20. So we will be a little bit on top of the time. And without further ado, let's get into it. So I am honored to be introducing Rebecca Ellis. Rebecca will be our moderator tonight. She is a reporter for Oregon Public Broadcasting, and her beat focuses around City Hall. She arrived in Portland 2 years ago after reporting stints in Washington, D.C., Salt Lake City, and Miami. She covers city politics, policing, and housing issues, some of which we'll hear about tonight. So thank you so much for being with us, Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you, James. And thank you everyone for being here tonight. I'm super pumped about this panel personally. I think for me at this point in my City Hall coverage experience, I think really everything I cover in some way is touching on this question of how do we revitalize, how do we come back, how do we make things better? And I think these questions can be asked about so many different issues in Portland. Policing, the affordable housing crisis, looming eviction crisis, all the challenges small businesses are facing right now. It can just feel like so many layered crises that Portland's trying to kind of come out of. And that's kind of why I'm so excited about this group that we have here for you tonight, who I think are going to be able to really give you all a bunch of really different perspectives on how to revitalize and what the future holds from a transportation angle, small business, houselessness, future of the workplace. We've kind of got it all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the panelists who are going to make some opening remarks. And then, as James said, we're going to move into questions. So we're going to start with Jarrett Walker. Jarrett is an international consultant in public transit network design and policy with 25 years of experience planning public transit in North America, Europe, Russia, Australia, and New Zealand. His firm, Jarrett Walker and Associates, based here in Portland, provides transit planning and executive advice to clients around the world. And his book, Human Transit, offers a friendly introduction to transit issues. In addition to his consulting, teaching, and speaking, he writes about public transit issues at humantransit.org. Jarrett, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to make, I think, fairly brief remarks. I'm here as the transportation expert, but I'm also here apparently, since this is an intergenerational group, I'm apparently here as the old person on the panel. So I want to say the kind of thing that old folks say, which I hope is useful, which is that I know you can change this city however you want, because in my lifetime, the city has already been completely changed. So I came to Portland in 1969. I see lots of names on here. I know there are people listening who've been around paying attention longer than that. Downtown Portland was mostly parking lots. There was just no reason to be there. There were some office buildings, and you got out of the office building and you basically went home because there was like no reason to be there. And a whole lot of visionary leaders and a whole lot of visionary citizens decided that this wasn't okay, and decided that they didn't want a city like this. And they showed the leadership and the commitment necessary to transform it completely. And the main thing about downtown Portland right now, that though that generation can't take any credit for, apart from some nice old things like the Elk, which I hope we'll see again, is the Elk, the park blocks, things like that. The only big thing they can't take credit for is the 200-foot blocks, the very short blocks we have in downtown Portland, which turns out to be really important. And when people travel around to different cities and they immediately say, "Oh, downtown Portland feels so intimate," that's actually technically what they're referring to. They're referring to the fact that the blocks are very short. So, but everything that has happened, the downtown that we have, was almost completely conceived and created, in my lifetime, in the last 30, 40 years that I've been watching, and that many other people here have been watching. It was, of course, created with the best of intentions by people coming from a particular perspective, working very much with the development community, because you have to work with the development community if you want to build a city. And it produced something which isn't as inclusive as we would make a city now if we were building it now. So fine, let's build the city again. Let's make it now what we want to be. But I think I'll start just by saying, I know we can make whatever we want out of this city, because it's already happened, and the older folks on this call have already seen it happen.
Thank you so much, Jarrett. Next up, we have Ady Leverette. Ady has lived in the metro area since childhood. She's an architect and graphic designer by training, and uses systematic thinking and creative insight to forge solutions in both the physical and policy realms. As the civic engagement manager for Business for a Better Portland, she recognizes that a thriving economy depends on a thriving community. I'm going to turn it over to Ady for her opening thoughts.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks, Jarrett, and thanks to Portland Forward for hosting this really important conversation. I'm so excited to be here alongside all these esteemed colleagues, and looking at the audience, so many amazing people in the audience too. I just want to recognize how great it is to see you all here. As Rebecca mentioned, tell people I'm from Portland, but technically I'm from Beaverton, and we all know that's not quite the same thing. But when I was 17, I got my first apartment downtown. It was a studio with a Murphy bed for $400 a month. And I fell in love with Portland and all its cityness, just as it was becoming cool in the late 90s. So I can't claim as much old Portland cred as Jarrett, but I have been here for a while. And that experience of living in a dense, walkable, culturally vibrant, and affordable place was deeply formative for me. So I've had a front row seat as Portland has grown and changed pretty dramatically over the past quarter century. As again, Jarrett just pointed out, change is totally possible because it's already happened. And like any long-term relationship, Portland and I have had our ups and downs, but through it all, Portland has always been pretty good at talking the talk. Our vision statements, our plans, our weirdness, our declarations of inclusivity have mostly been ahead of the rest of the country. But when it comes to walking that walk, we often fall short. And that makes some sense, right? Talk is aspirational. It's meant to motivate us towards something different. But I've always been surprised, often disappointed, and sometimes pretty heartbroken at how hard it is to make those changes, even when they're toward things that most people agree on. So when I think about what we need to do to move forward after this really extreme year of crisis upon crisis upon crisis, I think it's less about coming up with new solutions and new ideas, and more about developing a more nuanced understanding of what it will take to narrow that gap between Portland's talk and Portland's walk. We don't lack for good ideas. We don't lack for smart, talented people. And if we're willing to listen, we don't lack for moral compasses. But what are those barriers that keep us from making the right things happen? Now, November feels like a long time ago now, but a lot of people would say those barriers are political, and that might seem objectively true. But if we stay in a strictly political, that is a polarized and adversarial frame of mind, then we cede our agency to politicians and we set ourselves up for constant disappointment. So at Business for a Better Portland, we focus on civic engagement, which emphasizes our collective interest in good public policy and the power that underrepresented businesses in particular have to shape policy conversations. Because we all know that the business community isn't a monolith, but it's often represented that way in policy conversations. And it's often business reasons that are given for why we can't invest in the social infrastructure that the majority of people want and need. So at BBPDX, we take a more holistic perspective that social infrastructure, which includes abundant and affordable housing, efficient and equitable transportation, and equal access to economic opportunity, is fundamental, not incidental, to a thriving economy. And that racial justice is by definition economic justice, so it's impossible to support one without the other. So moving forward is going to require us to face things as a city that we might not want to face. You know, in our K-shaped economy, where on the upward slope, some people are doing, somewhere between pretty well and quite good, and on the downward slope, people are experiencing really extreme economic distress. We have to look beyond our own immediate circumstances and embrace the fact that our futures are inextricably tied together. Investing our time and resources and resilience is needed for all of us to succeed, not just those who are suffering right now. We have to fight our impulses to structure things the old way out of habit or for the comfort of normalcy. And we have to be willing to accept the risks of doing things differently. We have to try. So that's going to require a lot of trust and collaboration and a strong civic ecosystem that includes not only a responsive and accountable government, but innovative agencies and nonprofits, an engaged and forward-thinking business community, and especially people like all of you guys who are here, who would love to be at a concert or at the movies or at a park or spending time with your kids, or maybe you've actually had enough time with your kids lately, but you know what I mean. You'd rather be doing something wonderful in the city, but instead you're here putting our heads and hearts together on a Tuesday night for the benefit of the city as a whole.
Thank you so much, Ady. It's actually funny, you talked about the gap between walking the walk and talking the talk, and that is literally, I'd written that down as one of my questions to ask about how that happens so often, so we'll get there. Next up, we have Kaia Sand. Kaia has been the executive director of Street Roots since 2017, 2 decades after she worked as a staff reporter for the Burnside Cadillac, which was the predecessor to Street Roots, which I did not know. In those subsequent 20 years, Kaia worked as a poet, artist, community organizer, and university professor, focusing on economic injustice and homelessness. She's the author of 3 books of poetry, and in 2019, she was awarded a Spirit of Portland Award by Commissioner Joanne Hardesty, and in 2020, the Regional Society of Professional Journalists Small Newsroom First Prize for Best Column. Thank you, Kaia, so much for joining us tonight. I'm going to turn it over to you. Kaia, I think you're on mute.
Oh, that is the sentence of 2020, 2021. Thank you so much, Rebecca, to Jarrett, Ady, and thank you to James for organizing everyone who is here to grapple with these things tonight. As Rebecca said, I direct Street Roots. So for those of you who don't know, it's a weekly newspaper sold by, before the pandemic, about 800 people experiencing homelessness and poverty a year. We also produce Rosity Resources, which is a compendium of services for unhoused people. And as I thought about addressing this tonight, this idea of revitalizing the urban core, I've been thinking a lot actually in terms of transformation. There's a Street Roots vendor board member who was the co-founder of Right to Dream 2, Leo Rhodes, who's mentored me for the past decade. And I've been interviewing him lately to really ground myself in the change. And one thing he said to me is that there's so much apprehension around this idea of going back to normal because, of course, the norm wasn't so good for so many people. And so as I thought about my remarks tonight, I really thought about 3 themes that I'll just coax out right now and that hopefully I can return to, or I also just put out there as challenges to all of you. And that is really, as we think about, a city in which the poorest people have access to the riches of life, that our spaces are accessible to people across housing status. The themes that I think about are, what are the transformations that have actually been made possible during the state of COVID emergency? And I'll name some of them, and how do we build upon them? The second one is, how do we design our urban core in a way that's radically inclusive for people in poverty? How do we think about universal design, right, in ways in which we design for the most impacted people, but many people benefit? And thirdly, it's really important to always, I think, in this moment, to be addressing the fact that we have to reimagine public safety, and that is deeply important when we talk about the urban core. So I'm just going to really briefly mention a few of the transformations that I've seen for people experiencing houselessness during this time. And there are several different shelter options that actually we were able to circumvent locally that before were just not possible. One is these city-sponsored camp villages, C3PO they're called. And before that, these kinds of villages took direct action. And then at a certain point, the city would embrace tentatively, apprehensively or not, Right to Dream 2 and Dignity Village, namely. Hazelnut Grove is still in its own kind of limbo. But that is something that actually was expedited. What seemed impossible before, because people had to shelter in place, became possible. Number 2, car camping. It's this ridiculous situation, really, where people do have at least moderately decent shelter in the ability to lock a door, stay dry, but they're forced into this kind of punitive kind of limbo of having to move their cars from sides of the road. During the fire, it was a state of emergency. Suddenly, the parking lots that are always there became places people could legally park. Clackamas Town Center was filled with showers, with charging stations, with mutual aid and food. So that we see is possible when we have the political will. Number 3, distressed properties. We saw how badly this went after the financial collapse. Well, this time we saw our state legislature step up, put $65 million toward purchasing motels. That we'll see the final result of that by June. But that's something that, again, if given the political will, we can do. And then wrapping it up, and this is one, if you forget everything else I say, hygiene. And Nick Kristof of the New York Times just visited Street Roots and wrote a column about the hygiene efforts. And he's calling for a national infrastructure around public restrooms. I can get into this, but there's a kind of absurdity over the difficulty of dealing with this. So I'm going to just wrap up and say, with universal design, many of you, are designers on this call and know far more than I do, but the idea that if you design a ramp so that a wheelchair can go up, it also helps someone with a bicycle, it helps someone with a stroller, it helps someone lugging a suitcase. How do we actually think about that in terms of poverty, in terms of things like hygiene, in terms of things like parks and libraries and public commons? And finally, in terms of reimagining public safety, if we have a punitive carceral space, it's always going to be brutal for the poor. And we know, in terms of all the racial justice movements of the past year, it's brutal for so many of us. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to go back to any of these points later.
Thank you so much, Kaia, for that and all the amazing work you do, and kind of the hints of hope of rebuilding better. Our fourth speaker tonight is Ciara Pressler. Ciara is a business strategist specializing in entrepreneurship, brand strategy, and PR for creative professionals and thought leaders. She's the founder of Pregame, a professional development firm providing business coaching and consulting to established professionals and entrepreneurs, and Pressler Collaborative, a marketing and PR strategy consultancy. She's the author of 2 books, Game Plan and Exit Stage Right, creator of the annual New Year's Goal Brunch, host of business and marketing web series The Audience, a marketing reporter for Alleywire.com, and a guest speaker at conferences, universities, and professional events. Ciara, thanks so much for being here tonight. I'm gonna hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Journalists are my rock stars. So I'm like, we have OPB and Street Roots in the house. This is like, oh my gosh, we haven't had any live concerts. So this is my version of that from the last year. Yeah, I'm Ciara Pressler. My business is called Pregame. It's based in Portland. I did prepare an opening statement. So while you've all spoken, I've been thinking about what I've been thinking about lately in regards to Portland. But first, my qualifications. My family moved to the Portland area, which was Beaverton in 1989 when I was a kid. And that was before Portlanders saw it as Beaverton, and when they still saw it as like Beaverton. And so spent junior high and high school in that school district. I moved away for almost 20 years. I went to Seattle and then New York City, and then came back with a totally different perspective to a city that I thought I would never live in again. And so being born in California, I think I have an interesting perspective of being a Portlander, and yet also the outsiders that Portlanders sometimes resist moving in. On the theme of coming from multiple cultures, I am Black and white, so it's been a particularly interesting year for me. So the things I'm thinking about right now in regards to Portland, especially in regards to the last year, are more about the culture and psychology that prevails in Portland. And I'm pretty critical of it too, because I think a lot about how it holds us back versus how it's helping us. Some examples would be a wonderful panel I was on that was arranged by Radius, which is led by Lori Eberly, was called Portland Nice, and about how the culture of being nice is antithetic to being effective. I deal with that a lot in my business consulting, of people wanting to be nice and running their business into the ground as a result. And that could be translated to the nonprofit sector quite easily. Idealism being the enemy of the done. I think that progressives are amazing, and I consider myself progressive, but sometimes we become so idealistic about what we want to see happen that like nothing is good enough for us, and therefore nothing happens and nothing changes. I think there's sometimes a denial that we do live in America, which runs on capitalism, and sometimes we have to find a way to like work with that instead of work against it. And I am a small business advocate, and I believe in things like grants and funding and access to capital, but not for everybody, because guess what? Not everybody's good at running a business. And COVID has been devastating to some businesses that deserve to survive. And it's also been a way out for people who weren't doing great in the first place. And so I think, you know, some of the things that happen around business policy too, I would like there to be more thought and logic behind it. In the last year, I've had the privilege of working more in the public sector and in nonprofit. I led the strategic planning initiative for Portland Fire and Rescue and got a really fast education on how the department works. And if anyone sees anyone from the fire department anytime soon, just give them a hug or a high five or whatever is socially distanced, especially the unsung heroes, which is the admin team there. They have been through such a year that I will never complain about anything I've dealt with this year. I've also served on the governor's racial justice economic subcommittee, which was talking about potential solutions for economic healing for people of color. And it was like, wow, a room full of so many smart people, but like trying to reinvent wheels. And that's another thing of like Portland will operate in a bubble sometimes, where there are many cities all around the world that have already figured some of these things out, and we only need look to them for some solutions versus trying to start from scratch. More recently, I've had the privilege of leading some brand and marketing strategy for Home Share Oregon, which is part of Oregon Harbor of Hope, which you might recognize from like their shower trucks with part of the hygiene solution for the houseless. And also with the Street Trust, which is obviously a transportation advocacy group helping on the strategic plan for that. So I'm really interested in how everything is interconnected. I'm interested in how Portland culture works and whether it can work to solve some of these problems. I think things are possible, but I think right now our systems and attitudes are largely inefficient for creating real change.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, we're going to go into questions now. And I have a few prepared questions I'm going to ask, and then we're going to move into a question and answer session with audience questions. So as I go, everyone should feel free to just drop your questions in the chat, and we will be curating from there. So I think my first question for the panelists, and really anyone should feel free to jump in and answer this one, is actually, Ciara, you kind of just touched on it a little bit in your answer, but it's to what extent do you think local government is going to be the leader on revitalizing Portland and leading this charge versus to what extent are private companies, nonprofits more likely going to be the ones who are taking the lead here?
The way it has always happened has been both. The way it has always happened is with partnerships. You may not have called them public-private partnerships, but the way everything got built was government using, in some cases, its powers, its organizing powers, its powers to create consistent rules, its powers to bring down federal funding, and using that to create a space for the private sector to do what it does in America, which is make money, but make money by doing things that would build a good place for us. So I think it's always been both.
As someone who leads a nonprofit that's fairly grassroots, I do see the grassroots nonprofits, the small businesses in terms of the nimbleness and creativity, but I will always argue for the importance of the public sector, both in terms of scale and of course the scale we need from the federal level, and also in terms of always demanding that we do have the public sphere in mind and that we're not privatizing the spaces in which people would need to, in a sense, pay to play.
Yeah, and I just build on kind of the themes that Ciara has already mentioned about the culture of civic engagement and the culture of policymaking. That there's a phrase that I always amuses me is that culture eats policy for breakfast. And so I don't think policy or government, it drives culture. It's the other way around. And especially now, we had a fairly brutal election in November where I don't think, there's a lot of unity in the city council, the mayor and the other councilors, they're just getting started, but our current form of government and the evidence that we've seen so far doesn't lead us to believe that that they're going to be on the vanguard of leading the vision for the city. They're looking for the political support from the people who can, put together the most coherent and sensible and intersectional vision to make the things happen that, a lot of people, we agree already what those things are, but making them happen is the barrier that we face.
Yeah, I definitely hear that a lot covering City Hall, for sure. I think for my next question, I'd like to hear, I think all of you touched on this in some way, and this is a little broad here, but I'd love to hear what you all envision the urban core is going to look like in the future. Who's going to live there, who works there, travels there? Will downtown be a place where rich people have condos? Is that going to change? So it's kind of an open-ended question, but I would love any and all of you to jump in.
I'd love to make the point, because I think this was in the list of questions we were potentially going to talk about, that I think that revitalization of the core should start with the arts. I mean, that is a draw to travel, to come downtown. There's nothing I miss more than live performances in COVID. And, you know, the thing that excited me second most after, you know, the political will in the streets in this past year was that we had the best art that I've ever seen in Portland, which was like right on the streets in front of what used to be like the Apple store in Pioneer Place, you know, and I was like taking people downtown to see artwork on the street. And so, you know, I thought that it would be years before people really like sprawled. And I thought it would be the advent of, you know, autonomous vehicles that would push people way outside the city, but now everyone's moving way out because they want space, because they've been in their bubbles, you know, maybe in their condos, apartments downtown. But I think as maybe some more people move from bigger cities, which is gonna keep happening, just deal with it, you know, they want to have a night out, a place to go, places to spend their money. And I think the arts is a huge draw, bringing people like to the very central downtown and inner east side, because that's not something you're going to see matched ever on the same level even in an art center in Beaverton or something in Clackamas. It's just not ever going to match what you get downtown.
That's really interesting. So you think that focus should be on bolstering the arts downtown? And that should be the draw. Does anyone else want to jump in?
I just want to clarify, obviously not only for, you know, the revenues that it can bring in and the ways that it can revitalize business, but also public art. You know, I've heard of really innovative ideas for free performances, or, you know, we had a lot of street art because of the protests, which was pretty wonderful.
I just want to make a pickup on that point and say something that has been on my mind, which is that the more we get into arguments about statues of various historical figures, the more I like our statues of animals. And, you know, nobody is actually mad at the elk. We've taken away the elk for a while to take care of it, but nobody's mad at the elk. You know, those marvelous little animal statues alongside Pioneer Courthouse Square on Morrison and Pioneer Courthouse on Morrison and Yandhill. We have a lot. We have an interesting and very quirky history with the arts here. My mother was in the arts management in the 70s and 80s, so I know some of that history. And I think you're absolutely right. I think the arts have always been how we do it, and I think you're also right that we've been very good at doing art that doesn't look like public art out of a can, which is, of course, available for mass production and, you know, mass consumption as well. We've been pretty good at doing things that are quirky and interesting.
I'll take this and as a moment just to think about a city of the future, an urban core of the future that I hope to see. I love this discussion around arts and the warmth of a city in which everyone can participate in the creativity. And I have a real privilege of working every day with residents of our urban core who are living outside, but some of the most creative people out there, with massive talents, I'll add. So I love just even thinking it like, how do we have this kind of vibrant, inclusive urban core for everyone? And when I think about a future city and what it could look like, I do go back to this, the punitive nature of the way things are structured. Some of you on the call might know how much Street Roots has just been wrapped up in coming up with this alternative Portland street response. And right now it's a pilot in Lent. It's a medic and a crisis worker. The Portland Police Association, which you might have seen is in the news today, really worked to have its sphere limited through its negotiating to the pilots. So it's really on the line right now during the union negotiations. And I say all that to say, like, when I try to imagine a better city, for so many of our residents. I think about how we really have to flip things on its head in terms of the well-being of people, rather than wrapping up so many lives in the carceral system. So we really have to fight for this. Like, this is about changing our entire region from one that is very carceral to one that is actually very focused on public health and well-being.
Can I say one more thing on this, Rebecca? And just to play with your question a little bit, because I'm asked this question all the time: what do I think it will be? What do I think it will be? And I just always want to challenge us when we're asked that question to not believe the person's answer, because the future will be whatever you decide to make it, and I don't know what you're going to make it, and therefore you shouldn't want to know my prediction about the future. You can ask for my fantasy or for what I would like the city to be if I were king, but you shouldn't want my prediction. And because the beautiful thing is that no one of us can know. We get to create it.
Because we just don't know what's going to take place.
Yeah, and if when you accept a prediction, in my experience, when you let somebody give you a prediction and you believe that prediction, it puts you in a passive position, right? Because now this is happening anyway. All I have to do is get ready for it, right? Everybody who's trying to sell us stuff, driverless cars and everything else, they're always saying, this is coming, you better be ready. They want you in a passive position. They want you to be helplessly thinking about how you'll cope with that reality. And in my work, I'm always trying to create the space where citizens come together and they feel like, wait a minute, nothing's happening unless we do it. Right? And there isn't a prediction, there isn't a thing that happens without us working for.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Jarrett. I think articulating what we want the future to be, putting our energy into what we want rather than guessing what might happen based on past performance, I think is a much more powerful frame of mind. And I also really appreciate all this talk about the vital role that the arts play in not only creating a vibrant central city, that quality of distinctiveness that determines how successful and attractive a city can be, but it's going to help us kind of process all that we've been through. We've been robbed of the ability to gather for so long, and we haven't, like Ciara was saying, you're just dying to see a live performance, and how wonderful it is to, see the murals downtown and the new statues. And, we all have this hunger for that kind of expression of the now that we haven't been able to really have. And so I think that'll draw a lot of people. It'll create a lot of excitement, and then out of that excitement will create a lot of desire to rebuild. And then the question of, will rich people live in condos downtown? Probably, but hopefully there will also be a lot of people of various incomes that can live downtown and live humanely downtown. Everybody.
Funny, I actually, when I moved to Portland 2 years ago, I toured everywhere, but the place I loved most was downtown, in part because I actually loved all the public art, and I really liked the vibe of it, and I think it reminded me a little of New York, where I'm from. And yeah, I love living downtown.
Yeah, cities are attractive places to live.
Yeah, for sure. Are there any, and Kaia, you talked about this a little bit, but we're bogged down in so many crises right now. Are there any tangible kind of like buds of hope almost, that when you look into how the city of Portland is going to rebuild, you're like, that will be better? Is there anything concrete that sort of comes to mind? You touched on it a little with some of the things that are in the pipeline.
Well, I might as well, because it seems like the worst place to start. So so I'm going to start with toilets, because, and it's, you might have seen these red porta potties that are all over town, but in the 3 years that I've been in this position, I cannot believe how much people talk about feces without just dealing with the logical solutions to feces, right? And I think that part of it is that our public sector externalizes the job. In So when we hit the pandemic, the hygiene crisis around public health was more obvious, in part because the places in which it's externalized, some of them public, like the library, some of them like coffee shops, right? There's all these ways in which people are trying to eke in, but mostly there's, people can't manage. So there's messes, and then there's rage, and then the, newspapers are filled with letters to the editor, and people come to town and they talk about the equivalent of Portland is burning, right? Like there's all these things that keep happening when it's a really, in many ways, very simple situation that goes down to infrastructure. So the fact that the city finally worked around it with FEMA money and got 114 strategically placed porta potties around the city, I know from working with people, this is a radical improvement in life. Now that's very likely to go away, because it's part of a COVID emergency. And so it's just this kind of like very strangely short-sighted policy. If we actually built vibrant hygiene facilities, like if we draw from that and we build from there, so that people, they fly in from Europe and they are tourists and they have beautiful facilities. The people who are the poorest among us have beautiful facilities. The people who are doing package delivery or meter reading or whatever that have scant access have beautiful facilities. So that's something that I think infrastructurally we have actually started in the right direction. Finally, it's just so strange how hard it is, but we need to actually fully do it.
I saw an interesting question pop up here. Are there any public or private initiatives, actually just touched on this a little bit, but are there any public or private initiatives underway that you guys see as promising, you think have potential?
Okay, I already mentioned the Portland street response. I mean, that's something that was thought of several years ago, a couple years ago. It took a long time to get on the ground, but the pilot is finally starting. And it just, again, it's just a very common sense and humane way to deal with a problem that, for some reason we were just dealing with in a different way for so long. But the idea of using that trauma-informed model all throughout the city, I think is a really positive thing that's happening.
I saw someone put in the comments, what is Portland Street Response? So it's a city pilot that's being run through Portland Fire and Rescue as a pilot to have the first, in a sense, new first responder system in the city since the late 19th century. So it is a medic and a crisis worker. There's also community health workers that actually respond to so-called unwanted person calls that come through 911. So instead of coding and these calls to the police, they'll be coded to Portland Street Response, but it's only a pilot right now and it has to be expanded out citywide.
It's worth noting, Kaia, your organization is the one that came up with the original sort of idea and proposal, right?
Idea was out there. Cahoots does it well, but we just finally, as an outsider, could say, this is the plan.
Right. Okay. Can you guys? Oh, sorry. Can you guys hear me? That was weird. I have a sort of workplace related question. I guess I've been thinking a lot, maybe just because of my own job, about how these shifts in whether people are going into the workplace are going to affect sort of the urban core. I know my work's been talking about maybe not having people go back. Is that something that any of you have given some thought into, about how those patterns are going to change and change the way people move around the city?
I think Portland's an extremely community-driven place, and like we still have a small town like approach in that way, especially in business. And so like people like to go to the business breakfasts and the happy hours and have like gathering spaces. And my business was space-based until this week last year, and I hear a lot of my clients wanting to get back in person. However, I think one of the biggest barriers to that for business, at least for small business, is that commercial real estate has not been entirely helpful in that endeavor. And it's going to be an interesting reckoning, because this time last year, you know, my landlords were not acting like there was any problem going on and were unwilling to negotiate. And so I think sometimes there can be a lack of creative solutions around space here, you know, like empty spaces sitting empty that could be housing people, or, you know, a temporary art pop-up, or, you know, a small business pop-up for stores, you know, like what are we going to do with Lloyd Center? So there's a lot of creative solutions that are really easy, but I think one of the Portland cultural things that stops those things from happening is that there are so many groups and initiatives and maybe stakeholders that can be very territorial, and then everything becomes very unwieldy to actually move forward, because you need buy-in and agreement from so many different people, which is appropriate in that the community should have a voice in what's happening, and that's the mission of Portland Forward. But I think sometimes, again, we don't know. In Portland, I don't always see a great ability to compromise and negotiate when it will be a win-win for everybody.
Can I jump in on this when you're talking about the whole question of what happens to the office? And as always, because I don't believe in prediction, I'm not going to tell you that I know what happens to the office or what happens to demand, but everybody in my business, which is transportation, is thinking about this. And we're all grabbing each other by the lapel at conferences and saying, what do you think is going to happen? And some people are claiming to know, and you shouldn't believe any of those people. There is starting to be reason to believe that we will never be back in the office in the numbers that we were at before, going in the morning and coming back in the evening as we were before. Some tech companies, of course, who you can expect have the best conferencing software, are already saying that they're not going back at all. My company is probably going to, we want people to go back, but we're probably not going to be back as much of the time as we were. We'll probably come and go more during the day. And so that means something huge for transportation. And I want you to just be aware of how revolutionary this could be. Most of the big highway projects, most of the big, certainly the Southwest Light Rail project, many other transportation projects out there are built on arguments that are built on rush hour. Right? The whole argument for that project, I mean, there are all sorts of great things that these projects may do for you all day, but very frequently the critical case for the project that justifies the project, that draws down the funding, is about how this functions at rush hour. So I'm just trying in my work to just let everybody sort of be in this weightless moment when we don't really know, and don't cling too quickly to your assumptions that it's going to go back to the way it was, because whatever it's going to be, it probably won't be the way it was. And I've had conversations with other people on this call about this. It's a lively thing, but serving the peak is very expensive. Designing transport systems to truly saturate the demand for everybody who wants to get downtown at 7:55 a.m. right at that time, that's very expensive. You build enormous capacity that you're not going to use very much. You're going to use only very briefly. And that's true in transit, and it's also true in highways, of course. On the transit side, not so much in Portland because we don't have much rush hour express service, but in cities that have lots of rush hour express service, there are exciting possibilities. If we need just a little bit less of that, we could afford a whole lot more buses running back and forth all day, where they're useful to all kinds of people. Because the key to transit, by the way, I'm always saying high transit ridership is diverse transit ridership. And we're always trying to design the transit systems that are where the same vehicle going down the street is useful to as many different possible people doing as many different possible things. So I have some optimism about that, but nobody knows.
That's just so interesting. Like, just to think of this idea of peak rush hours just being either non-existent or fundamentally changed is pretty wild. Let's go to, we had a protest question, several protest related questions. how do you guys, and again, this could kind of be for everyone, see the future of protests and activism playing out downtown? Are we going to see a future here where downtown protests coexist as part of just downtown activities? Is that not at all in the cards? What do you guys see as the relation there?
Maybe a bit of history.
Yeah.
I was riding my parents' shoulders through demonstrations against the Vietnam War in the 1970s. I bet there are people who were actually standing and walking of their own accord at that time. Portland has always been a protesting city. And yes, there has always been some lawlessness around the edges of protests. There always is. So I often, when you're feeling overwhelmed by this, grab your favorite old person who's been around here for a while and get some perspective on this. What's happening is not really new. It's a different issue. It's a different kind of anger. But believe me, during the draft, plenty of people were angry about the fact that people in their 20s were being randomly yanked out of their lives and sent off to die. People were pretty angry about that too. So if this is not new. This is something we've survived before. And although the livability marketing that has surrounded Portland has often been very much about presenting this as a non-threatening, peaceful place where if you invest, history will never happen to you here. That's not true. It's never been true. No reason to pretend that.
So you don't see this as a sort of unique, as it's kind of been discussed, at least Mayor and Smith says, a unique, not at all what the protests in the 60s, not at all what that was. You don't see that.
No, the protests in the 60s were a lot like this. and frankly, I certainly welcome in the chat the comments of other people who have their own memory of that time. Yeah, there was a lot of this going on then. I mean, of course, the media was different. We didn't have the extraordinary amplification power of social media. Never mind, the conservative media that just wants to, where every fire in a trash can is Portland is burning down. So the amplification is different. And so the way we perceive it and the way we, because human beings, boy, if you're getting the same information from lots of different places, it must be true, which is how, of course, the mirror effect of social media works. Right? You're hearing this from a lot of different places, but it's actually ultimately coming down to, one thing that's been multiplied in a whole of mirrors.
I just wanted to add that, when the injustices exist, it does us no good to have a veneer over the injustices, right? That we're just going to benefit the folks those of us who benefit the most from the injustices. And I see a parallel really in terms of so many of the kind of short-sighted solutions to homelessness, where a lot of solutions are really about having people out of sight, but the poverty exists, right? So, when the racism exists, when the poverty exists, it's not a healthy society for us to just want to be able to close some shutters.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, people talk about wanting to attract tourists. We can't attract tourists if there's protests going downtown. But, from anybody who's been in the dating world, it's much more effective to attract the right people if you do the work on yourself on the inside rather than just get a good haircut, right? So I think that's where we need to focus.
I like that. The city should just make itself a more appealing suitor.
Yeah, I will not forget that metaphor, Ady.
I want to give a really different perspective, especially, in light of everything since May. People of color are watching closely and carefully. And in the same way that maybe things haven't changed in protests, we're trying to figure out whether things have really changed in the way that Portland deals with race. And, does everybody have a Black Lives Matter sign in their yard and that's it? And that's where it ends? What we're talking about when y'all aren't around is, why do I stay in this city? Like, what is my loyalty to this city if this city is doesn't really have my back? Like, it's amazing that people stay. It's not not necessarily why should I live in Portland? It's why shouldn't I leave? Because the tenor of the white allyship in Portland is very different than it is in some other cities. And to me, it's more oppressive. I've had more racist encounters in the last year from like well-meaning white progressives. I almost would rather deal with people who are more ignorant or something like that. And it's hard to articulate here. I think there's a great editorial written by Tiara Darnell in the Portland Monthly, if someone wants to hit that link. You know, but with everything going on, and especially that moment where there was a rally that met at Clackamas Town Center with the trucks, and they basically got a police escort downtown and had carte blanche to shoot paintball guns and bear mace into the streets, and the police basically like cleared the way for them. That tells me and people like me that the city doesn't actually have our back. Who cares if they put out a DEI toolkit? Who cares if we can't walk around the city safely? And I left Portland before the election because I was like, I don't know if I want to be around here for all of that. I left the city because I don't feel like the rest of my life has to be based on like taking microaggressions in hopes that maybe someday, you know, things work out. Like I can just move to a city where people accept me and don't tokenize me. Much easier than putting up with everything else. And so, you know, when it comes to the not just the protests, but the reactions to the protests, like people of color are watching when it comes to the way the city interacts, the way the police interact, the way street response is going to go, everything.
Rebecca, you're muted.
Unmuted. I just want to make sure I heard you. You actually left the city during the election because you just didn't want to be around that and see what the reaction was.
Yeah.
All right. We have a question for Kaia. What would housing look like in Portland if we launched the right strategy to address homelessness, whatever that may be, and sustained it for a decade?
Well, I mean, I think that if we break it apart into a lot of its different pieces, it's not just about housing, right? It's about the fact that there's a chasm between housing affordability and wages. So we're not just addressing the housing affordability, which we do know as rents go up, homelessness goes up, and we have a massively unaffordable city. We also have to address the fact that that people don't earn high enough wages. A housing wage locally is $22 an hour, right? Like that's 2 full-time minimum wage jobs. You know, we couldn't even get a federal government that could get $15 an hour. So there's those pieces. There's systemic racism. There's the fact that, you know, there's all of the ways in which people have been disenfranchised from wealth for generations and continue to be. And so we don't have the same heritable wealth in every community. We have the average African-American, Native American families locally who are priced out of all rented housing when they make the average wage in our city, right? Like all of these are part of it. It's not just building houses. And we have the carceral system, the prison system, the fact that we, you know, release people from prisons and they don't have a pathway out of poverty. I mean, at Street Roots, we have letters all the time from people who are awaiting release because they know they'll be in poverty. So they want to get our Rose City Resource Guide so they can start planning the services that they could possibly find. So I just want to say, like, there's a lot of fronts. There's climate justice. You know, when we talk about homelessness, when we talk about destabilization of shelter, we saw that with the fires, right? And that's going to be more and more frequently, unfortunately, that there's going to be people that are climate refugees locally as well as globally. So I know this is a very kind of overwhelming response, but I would say it's that we have to be indefatigable. So it's not just a 10-year plan, right? That's a kind of fit in a box. It's taking it on in all of these different directions, and it really takes all of us.
I'm interested, I don't know, as many people here might know, there's a pretty big proposal going in front of City Council tomorrow. It's called the Shelter to Housing Continuum, and it's complicated, but essentially what it's going to do is it's going to make it a lot easier for providers to site shelters and create cheaper housing options like RVs and tiny houses on wheels. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And how big a difference you think that could make in city's homelessness crisis.
And yeah, and I'm happy for other folks to jump in on this too, because I think probably other folks are thinking about it. But I just want to say it's essentially, in my mind, it's taking what is positioned as an emergency and bringing it into city code, right? That we rely on emergencies to get around red tape. And there are just so many barriers, as I mentioned in the beginning, to just doing really basic solutions to make survival better. So since 2015, the city has been renewing a state of housing emergency, and that has made possible some of the shelter siting. And that's about to expire in April. And then on top of that, we had the COVID emergency. So it was the doubling up of the two that the city was able to do anything, like the C3PO or putting shelters in Charles Jordan and Mount Scott. Those are both in what's called open space. And that's the most controversial piece of it. There's a lot of, I would say, fear mongering around this, because really a lot of the open space, it's not like, it's a free for all. There's all kinds of steps. There's still all of the red tape, right? But it's actually just shifting the zoning so that even if an emergency isn't declared, it's possible to put a shelter in these spaces that include parking lots, that include sort of, the kind of manicured or the kind of landscape spaces, right? It's not just like these kind of protected environmental spaces. So I do want to push back on, I think, a lot of fear mongering that's happening. It feels very common sense to me to stop having so many zoning blocks to doing super basic things that are just about making survival better, not even, beginning to deal with just the housing crisis itself. We're still like 5 steps backwards and 2 steps forward just to get that done.
I don't know if anyone else has thoughts they want to, it's a big proposal. I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in. If not, we have some more.
I think it's a really important proposal, and it is controversial. And these are the moments where it's important to make your voice heard, even if there is, queasiness about whether or not it's attacking the issue high enough up on the systemic level, or if it's, more of a stopgap measure. But I think, as Kaia points out, it's just very common sense and pragmatic at this moment. And for once, it's a little bit forward thinking. If we, hopefully this, the moratorium on evictions won't end and there won't be mass foreclosures and evictions coming out. But, it could be that our homeless population skyrockets in the future, and we can't just keep pretending that people aren't sleeping on the street when they are, and being more organized about it, and letting people who want to open up their, faith organizations and people who want to build alternative types of extremely low cost housing, like just making that possible is just the right thing for the city to do.
All right, we have a question. I don't know, this one might be for Ciara, but anyone should feel free to jump in. If businesses don't go back to the offices, where do people find themselves in their free time? And if we feel the need to interact, is that within the neighborhood, or is there something bigger that could be created? There would be an opportunity to access these spaces. I don't know if anyone has thoughts on that one.
I'll jump in and say, we've already, when I was a kid, we had a downtown that worked fine for workers. People went down there in the morning, they worked, they left. Downtown can't just be for people who work there. Mm-hmm. And downtown, like so much of, like much of our inner city, there have to be so many reasons to want to be there, even if you have to intentionally go there, even if it's not just a place you go naturally in the course of your day. And I think that, starting in the 70s or 80s, the city has worked very hard to become that. I'll add one other thing because it's kind of connected to the previous question. It matters enormously where we end up, where low-income people end up having to live and where homeless people end up having to live, and where these transitional arrangements work. And I just want to make sure that it's great that everyone is frustrated with Portland and wants to improve on how Portland's doing things. When I go around the country, which is mostly what I do, and help other cities figure out their public transit systems, what I see everywhere is, we found a place in an industrial park to build a homeless shelter, so you have to run a bus out there. We've built a new giant low-income housing project on a cul-de-sac up on a down in a little gully next to a freeway. Can't cycle there, no way to get a bus into it. That kind of stuff is being done all the time. And thanks to our urban growth boundary, and thanks to some reasonably, thanks to some people having thought about this over the years, it's not that bad. But we still have this problem of, understandably, people who are doing well, wanting a little bit of control over who's around them in their neighborhood, who's on the street in front of their house. And that's just not what cities are. And I think that's our next big challenge. Sorry to go off on that. It was connected to the previous question as well.
It's really interesting.
I think we were already having this conversation in the context of retail. Now that there's online shopping, what happens to stores? And so what's going to happen to malls? That's been a really interesting conversation that I've been following for a while. And people still need to have experiences, right? We all crave togetherness. We're tribal people. And so, I think people will travel for experiences, whether that's the arts or sports or a night out. Experiences are going to be really crucial to rebuilding the core or any place else that you want to bring people. And that requires creativity, and Portland has no shortage of creativity. I'm really fascinated by the idea of a third place, and that was part of when I started pregame, it being a physical space that was sort of like a business clubhouse, because people have work and home, but they need a third point of the triangle, and people aren't, maybe church members like they used to be. So what is that third place? Maybe if we don't have an office, we just need a second place. So is that the gym? Is that some sort of social club? Is it a volunteering opportunity? People still need to gather and have a place to go. I will say I've had a pretty vibrant social life virtually over the last year, and it's been awesome. I've made,
yeah, right.
Wow.
I mean, I'm also the kind of person who initiates things, but I mean, I've had a weekly Zoom with my best friends from high school. I had a weekly support group Zoom for people who just needed to talk, I connected with family members I never even knew before. And so having some of that quiet has helped me to clear out my values and what's important to me and who I want to spend time with. And I think there might be ways to weave those sentiments of, maybe how people are changed after this year into what new experiences might be.
That's really amazing, by the way, just your Zoom social life. I started that at the beginning for a month, and I had my Sunday night things, and then no one wanted to talk after a while.
You didn't come to ours, Rebecca.
Thank you. Okay, I really like this question. So since we're talking about the Central City, it would be great to hear Jarrett, Ciara, Kaia's thoughts about the impacts of downtown clean and safe. I don't know, I'm sure a lot of you saw that a few weeks ago now, that Willamette Week story about how the Enhanced Service District downtown was subsidized by the Portland Business Alliance. Are there other ways you could imagine leveraging those tax dollars? Should those tax dollars be going to an ESD like that? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in briefly. So the ESD, it's also in other areas, they're called BIDs, Business Improvement Districts. And there's a Berkeley study that showed that often there's a correlation between anti-homeless laws and the advocacy that are connected to these. So it's always something really important to watch. There's a way in which they can privatize our tax dollars. Clean and Safe, it's really, two different entities. So it's this private security company that has police ties, and then it's it's Central City Concern, the nonprofit running the clean portion that's a job program. So you can just imagine untangling that, right? And doing public safety in a different way. We've talked about a lot of my views on that, so I'm not going to go into that, but we can reimagine how public safety looks. And then in terms of the jobs program, Central City Concern can still run that. There's other, models to do that in terms of cleaning up spaces.
And that contract is up for renewal in the fall. So that'll be an opportunity to weigh in on what should be informing the ESD, if it exists as it has, or if a more trauma-informed response, such as the Portland Street response, is more appropriate to apply to downtown.
I thought that was also, like, I knew sort of about enhanced service districts, but just sort of untangling that, it was so fascinating that sort of structure exists. And
right?
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I had no idea. Yeah, I thought it was super fascinating. Let's see. Okay, we have a urban mobility question for Jarrett. So anyone could jump in. How do we make the perception of transit more equitable and in fact be more equitable? One perception currently is that public transit is for poor people and electric cars are for rich people. What are the values around transportation and what would it mean for the core?
Excellent question. I have been working for the last 30 years as a consultant, trying to improve mostly the bus layer of public transit networks. That's pretty much what I do. It's pretty much what our firm does. Mm-hmm. We go in and help cities think about how that layer of the public transit network is working and how to make it better in a way that meets their goals. And there's this fundamental question about, is the purpose of public transport, and particularly is the purpose of buses, to be part of a complete network that's there for everyone as civic infrastructure? Or is its purpose to symbolize a class difference in a way that essentially encourages class segregation, in a way that frankly can be comforting to both sides of that class debate? And it's immensely challenging because because I hear the equity advocates wanting fares to be lower. I hear the equity advocates wanting more focus on the low income concern. And the worst public transit system for poor people is a system that only poor people use. You, above all, need the diversity of the ridership. And that's really, I think, the challenging thing about all of these questions now about, what we want to do with transit, how we want to embody an equity concern, how we want to embody a racial justice concern, while also, working with the basic reality that, as the famous former Bogota mayor Enrique Peñalosa likes to say, a great city is not one where the poor drive, it's where the rich use public transportation. So public transportation can't be specialized around anyone for it to really succeed at its best. And the more you look at that, the more challenging that is for absolutely all points of view on the political spectrum. This bus is not just for you, whoever you are, because it's precisely the diversity of the people on that bus that in all spectrum of diversity, in all dimensions of diversity, that are why the system is succeeding, if it's succeeding.
And I just want to add, it doesn't serve the poor that well. I mean, they have to pay to actually, when we talk about different affordability issues, the transit system's too expensive, even low income fare that people have to jump through massive hoops to get to. When we talk about vaccines, the first question I would hear from people is, well, how am I going to afford public transit to get out to whatever the place is?
Well, why is it out wherever? Why do we do things at such a scale that people have to go to remote parking lots in the suburbs in order to get to things like that? Why aren't there vans running around the neighborhoods? I mean, there are all kinds of solutions to that but again, I mean, just to say again, a successful, equitable an equitable and successful transportation system is still going to be frustrating for everyone, is still going to be somewhat frustrating for everyone because it's not specialized around anything. And that's always the challenge. And, you know, as a former poor person myself, I'm in no way implying that we should be any less concerned about the experience of low-income people. But we have to develop our transit system in such a way that a diversity of people, including a diversity of incomes, actively want to use it, because that's the kind of transit system that the whole city will support and that the whole city will be engaged in. That's a very difficult question. Yeah.
I think that's all we have time for tonight, unfortunately. But thank you guys all so much, and thank you for joining me. I'm just going to turn it over to James for some final remarks. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you to the panel. Zoom is not, this is one thing where it's so much, I think actually it's a mixed bag with Zoom. As somebody who's really involved in civic engagement, it has been really heartening to see how much more all the remote access to government services, whether it's testimony in Salem or City of Portland, I mean, they're really hearing from a lot of folks who have never been able to take a day off to go down to Salem or take a few hours and interact with bureaucrats at City Hall. So, Zoom is a mixed thing, and I think there are some big positives that I hope that we keep with us. But all of that was a long way of saying, I wonder if people can do the little reactions or the little clap thing. It is like really great. I thought this was a really inspirational panel, and I feel like I learned a lot and definitely heard from perspectives that I would not have otherwise heard from. So thank you, Rebecca and Jarrett and Ady and Ciara and Kaia for both spending your time with us on a Tuesday evening and also for sharing your expertise and your perspective with us. We here at Portland Forward, as I mentioned at the beginning, we like to convene conversations like this, hopefully conversations that would not have happened otherwise. We are really appreciative of all of the folks who decided to spend part of your Tuesday evening while it was sunny and dry out here nerding out on the future of our city. You are our people. The other stuff that Portland Forward does, as I mentioned at the beginning, is advocate for progressive change for our city. We are excited about the big, bold vision for the city. I really loved the question. I think a few of the questions had this kind of tenor to them, but asking Kaia about, what would, if we did housing right and did it for 10 years and really invested, what would, the city look like? And those are the types of things that I think we need an engaged constituency behind who are pushing for those big, bold solutions where Portland can lead. So we welcome you to join us. Nate is going to paste a link into the chat. We had an idea as part of this event, which we will continue forward, to solicit ideas from folks. If you had thoughts for something that you wish Portland would do, we'd love for you to submit it at the link that Nate just put into the chat. And for some of those ideas, and of course we're not trying to steal your great ideas. If those, we would of course attribute it to you if that's what you wanted. But some of them we're hoping to put into a letter and send over to City Council and just say, here's some ideas from engaged Portlanders about things that we could be doing as we think about resilient recovery. So with that, I will let everyone get back to the rest of their Tuesday night. Thank you so much again to our panelists and for all of you for caring so much about this city and working to make it as good as it can be. Have a good night.
James.